It should come as no surprise that legislators are eager to maximize learning and skills development. Credible voices, from the Business Roundtable to the National Academy of Sciences, are insistent that we will need more people with deeper and more diverse skills, as well as the ability to work in teams if we're to meet the challenges of the future. In response, educators have focused on starting learning earlier, recognizing that early learning builds the foundation upon which all skills development is built. Other countries agree. Most of our allies and competitors have strong early education policies and programs. Scientists agree. If we want a deeper bench, we need to start earlier. An overarching message of our statement, based in the developmental and learning sciences, is that pre-K is not an end in and of itself. Pre-K does not happen in a vacuum. A child's learning over the course of the pre-K years builds on past development and sets the stage for future learning, which is then affected by children's experiences in kindergarten and beyond. Learning is continuous and cumulative. Effective pre-K education depends on attending to what happens before pre-K, what happens during pre-K, and what happens after pre-K as children enter elementary school.
Thank you for staying with us through panel 6. Thanks to everybody joining online. I'm Erica Greenberg. I'm a Principal Research Associate at the Urban Institute, and we are all very fortunate to have with us today Katherine Magnuson, Professor of Social Work at UW-Madison, Stephen Dow, legend, of course, Early Childhood Advisor to the Mayor of Houston, Sylvester Turner, and former Executive Director of CAP of Tulsa County, and Daphna Bassok, Associate Professor of Education and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. I'd like to start with Deborah's words in that wonderful clip. She said, "It should come as no surprise that legislators are eager to maximize learning and skills development." Governor Polis said earlier today that UPK is part of America's competitive landscape, and yet we're all emerging from the pandemic at a time of fractious politics. So tell us a little bit about how you come to the panel, how you come to your work, and then how those words resonate with you. Stephen, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, I mean, we heard a little bit about sort of what I'd call the accidental origins of the Tulsa pre-K or the Oklahoma pre-K program. And I think that sort of the conclusion of the fact that it's resonated powerfully with policymakers and parents and communities, that it's a natural earlier starting point for the school system to begin recognizing what we know. And the challenge has been that I think in many ways, as it's been implemented, we've paid a lot of attention to what happens. And in fact, I think the bulk of the conversation today has been about what happens with pre-K after kids leave. And we've spent precious little time talking about what the systems are that are, and I think Professor Phillips's comments alluded to it, what are the conditions that kids are in before they come to pre-K. And to imagine that we begin implementing pre-K systems without paying sufficient attention to the systems that are trying to deliver things to kids during those earlier years, I think is a mistake. And it's one that sort of certainly we've seen the impact of that in Oklahoma, because as Oklahoma implemented pre-K at scale, it decimated the childcare sector for 0 to 3 because it ruined the economic model, and we didn't go back and try to increase the reimbursement rates to ensure that we could be giving kids a high quality set of experiences before.
That's great. Daphna, how does that resonate for you?
So I come at it as a researcher, but also having partnered for the past almost a decade with early childhood leaders in Louisiana and in Virginia. And I think they have taken kind of a somewhat different approach to trying to address early childhood, which is from the beginning very focused on system building, sort of like what you were saying, Stephen, and focused on the idea that we can't build just pre-K systems. We have to look at kind of the whole set of systems that are available to kids from 0 to 5, and particularly kind of building coordination and cohesive systems for childcare, Head Start, pre-K, family childcare homes, and thinking how do all of these work together. So to your question, I think, coming out of the pandemic, there is more enthusiasm and awareness of the importance of both pieces of that, both kind of like knowing how much children potentially lost during the pandemic, seeing the recent NAEP results, being very concerned about kids learning. I think there's a lot of interest in like what are the interventions we could put in place that really help kids learn. And there is a huge amount of interest in kind of noticing that both schools and early childhood programs serve these dual roles of both childcare and education, and knowing in a much more kind of widespread way across the families and the economy that if we don't have systems that provide for both simultaneously, we can't have people going back to work, we can't have women in the workforce at the same rate. So I think there's a lot of energy around that, and obviously also a lot of challenges, especially with kind of how things played out with Build Back Better, as we talked about earlier today.
I, probably like many of you in the room, I sort of fell over pre-kindergarten somewhat early in my career. I wasn't looking for it, and it found me when I was doing a paper and saw that there were impacts of pre-kindergarten that were larger than the impacts of some other preschool-like programs. And I like to credit myself with being an early founder, because I think every researcher who's sitting in the room has cited my paper as a reason for why their studies were needed more, because mine wasn't good enough to answer the question. So you're welcome to all of you to have a straw man. But seriously, I stumbled across it, and a lot of my work focuses really on poverty and how poverty affects children and families. And I came to an interest in pre-kindergarten and preschool and childcare because of its powerful impacts on children. But I still, and children's learning and their skill development and all that that means for their life chances down the road. But I still come back and try and center that family perspective. And as Daphna says, think about it from the system perspective, which is there are a lot of policies that touch, social policies that touch children and families. And to the extent that we really want thriving communities that have sustainable childcare systems, that have high quality teachers throughout the pre-K or birth to 12 system, I think it's really important to take a broader perspective and think not just what is this classroom doing for these kids in this moment, but what are the range of programs and supports that are needed across that birth to K-12, and really contextualize pre-K as one of those programs in a list or a continuum of many types of programs. Because there's certainly not going to be a silver bullet for a one pre-K room fits all sizes, one type of program fits all sizes. So that's sort of how I think about, and even more so now because the pandemic has generated so many range of needs for children and families, mental health, learning supports, economic supports. There's a lot of need.
Absolutely. So let's zoom in a little bit on Tulsa, as we have been throughout the day, and then we're going to zoom back out into some of these broader systemic issues and thinking about the whole kind of holistic needs of families. So something that's been kind of teased out throughout the day is the question about replication, or we might in research say generalizability of what happened in Tulsa. So I want to think about those dynamics in terms of the policy success there, the practice success, and the research success. In terms of policy success, amidst the current political landscape, what can other jurisdictions draw from what happened in Tulsa?
Well, I think I always worried that we would end up defunding pre-K because Oklahoma's fiscal environment is highly dependent on a commodity that's in the ground that fluctuates wildly in prices. And so Oklahoma is accustomed to boom-bust cycles. And I really used to worry a great deal when we would face the school funding shortfalls and the state budget shortfalls, that people would say, why are we funding pre-K? Let's repurpose that money and put it just in the K-12 system. And I think what we found is that it was essentially sort of the genie was out of the bottle, and school superintendents loved it, and legislators understood what its impact was in their communities. And so that worry really didn't ever materialize. And I think what we haven't talked about is that this is done in a very, very red state. And, and it's not just at it wasn't just at the state legislature that we had strong bipartisan support among the congressional delegation. I mean, one of the leading voices here on the Hill, who was the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee on Labor HHS and was largely responsible for driving enormous increases in the Child Care Development Block Grant and Head Start and Early Head Start, was Representative Tom Cole from Oklahoma, and a conservative Republican. So I do think that that even as Governor Pohl has said, that there's really a strong bipartisan support for this idea that we should be doing things for younger kids. And I think there's an understanding that learning happens earlier than the system that we have as our public education system recognizes. And so investments there make sense.
That's great. Yeah.
And I would add, I think that a part of the Tulsa story is not just the investment, although I think we should all be clear that that's a huge part of the story. But I think it really takes some leadership at the local level and a vision for what that can look like. So I come from a red-purple state that has also invested at the state level in pre-kindergarten programs, but is so decentralized that it really trickles down to the local level to be implemented and looks vastly different in our rural counties than in our urban counties. And so I think a part of it is really having boots on the ground and leadership that understands what good early childhood education can look like and will serve as a champion for it to really ensure not only is it funded adequately, but that there's a good workforce that's hired and well-trained, and then is willing to continue to look at it and see where improvements can or should be made over time, rather than to just cut the check and sort of walk away. I think it takes that someone talked about continued and sustained values around the importance of early childhood education. And I think everyone who is here from Tulsa has showed us that that's, if not in the water, it's now in the community as a thriving part of the community. And I think figuring out how to cultivate that in other places is challenging if it isn't a shared vision.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, it seems like the politics, to your point, the support for early childhood is very high and only growing throughout the pandemic. So I don't think there's a lot of buy-in on the convincing people that this is worthwhile both for business and for families and for kids' development. I think that story has sort of penetrated, but there's a funding problem. There is a huge cost to doing this and to doing it in a way that meets those multiple goals, like meeting the needs of children and providing a high quality program in a way that works for working families and gets them the hours of childcare that they need while they are at work is really complicated and expensive, really so fundamentally different from how we have been doing it up to now. And so I think I've been thinking about it a lot because I'm teaching a class right now on education policy and have so many students so baffled by how we fund early childhood compared to K-12 and why it is such a fragmented system and why it's operated so differently when we do K-12 at such higher levels. And then I think to Katherine's point, I think, with Build Back Better turning out how it has, it's really sort of created this moment where states have have to sort of figure out their position, but that's both on the funding side, but also on the kind of like leadership side of how you take a lot of local communities that have really variable kind of readiness to take this on, not because they don't like the idea or want the idea, but it is a lot of work to build and to coordinate across childcare, Head Start, pre-K, put it all together, and that is like a role that states really need to invest in, and so that piece is really hard too. The funding and the coordination to do this, not just in one area where the buy-in is high and there's a lot of infrastructure and a lot of willingness, but to go into the communities where there needs to be a lot more hand-holding and supports and infrastructure building.
That's great. So we're talking about leadership in policy, leadership in funding. There's also got to be leadership in the classroom, right? And that happened in Tulsa. What can we learn about the kind of practical success? What are the implications for the early education workforce, both in pre-K, but then also in Head Start, childcare, all of the other early childhood programs that are going on there?
Well, I think we were able to shift over time the narrative that what was going on was babysitting and childcare into this is a part of the public education process. And that took time and work. I mean, Karen referenced the notion that we intentionally built our schools and our facilities on the grounds of the elementary schools, and we created physical environments that really sent a message to educators and parents and other teachers in the community that this was a part of the education system. But notwithstanding that, and notwithstanding sort of compensating at the same level that the school system was, it was still, particularly in the early years, a challenge to attract people to teach in the earlier grades. I think, I was on years ago an NAESP task force that described the roles of elementary school principals as typically just walking right by the kindergarten and first grade classrooms, well before we were talking about pre-K classrooms, and not really appreciating what was going on there. And so I think at a certain level, the sort of issue of how you build that workforce in a way that really respects and sends the message to teachers that they are really a critical part of the delivery system takes a lot of not just work at compensating, but compensating and treating them like the valued professionals that we say that they are.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think, the issues that we wrestle with in workforce are different in early childhood for several reasons, but also they are the same types of issues in slightly different flavors and colors that the K-12 schools wrestle with. So we have yet to identify the perfect way to train an early childhood teacher, just in the way that we haven't identified the perfect way to train a K-12 teacher. We think a lot and have some successful models on in-classroom supports and coaching, but we haven't cracked that nut fully either. And so I think as we talk about the class not doing what we think it's going to do, there's a lot that we haven't figured out about how to make the sauce, build the perfect classroom. And I think sometimes some honesty about that is important. It is sometimes better to say that, the credentials or the degree don't always follow the high level of skill that we're hoping for than it is to implement a policy that is going to extract all the BA teachers out of the childcare classrooms and leave only those that are less educated in those classrooms. So there's just a lot of complexity to the workforce, and I think the challenging part is that they, and it appears in Tulsa too, that there's not conversations across sectors on that. That the Head Start, or as one colleague of mine says in Milwaukee, you start in a child care center. If you're good, you move to the Head Start Center, and then you're hired by Milwaukee Public Schools out of the Head Start Center into their 4K program. And I think the consequences of that for Milwaukee are actually quite profound. But we don't often talk about those in the context of talking about pre-K.
Yeah, I mean, I think, teachers are the definition of quality in these classrooms. So when you talk about a high quality early childhood experience, you're basically talking about interactions young kids are having with their teachers. And we have structured it so that the people who do the hard work of spending their days with young children often have very few supports and very low levels of compensation. And then to Katherine's point, the fragmentation and the differences across sectors are huge. And so you have kind of, like in the work we've done in Louisiana, you have most young kids, 0 to 3, are in places where teachers are turning over at such a high rate that half the teachers that are there one fall are gone by the next fall. And so that kind of definition of quality, of just having people there continuously, even within the school year for a child, but long enough to benefit from the coaching or the professional development, is really, really huge. And you can see that in Head Start, where teachers are getting paid more, the turnover is significantly lower. And then you see the pre-K system in Louisiana, which is in the public schools, and those teachers turn over at half the rate of childcare teachers, but still higher than the teachers who are the K-12 teachers. So it doesn't feel that complicated. It feels very clear that we've sort of created systems where certain working with certain age groups is seen as something that requires more supports, more compensation, more training, and then we, accordingly have those high levels of turnover and really struggle to create kind of stable experiences for kids. And families are navigating that too. I mean, even if you are in a state that is doing really well by 4-year-olds, oftentimes that does nothing for summers, and it does nothing to cover the full length of the day for families. And so even for the 4-year-olds who have access to even a universal pre-K program, there are still parts of the day that are kind of challenging, and then we are so far from that on 0 to 3. So I think those kind of systems of like, how do we think about high quality, not just for the year before kindergarten, but sort of for the whole system, and then how do we do it in a way that sort of investing in the 4-year-olds doesn't sort of by definition take away resources from the child care centers or the Head Starts in ways that make it take a sector that's already struggling and make it still harder.
And I'll just comment, in Wisconsin, we're one of the states where we have, I think 30% of the 4K funding does go to community partners, and so people often suggest that that is a mechanism, but we've seen similar impacts. That simply saying that some of the money goes to existing 4K programs to pay for 4K isn't necessarily going to be enough to change some of the perhaps unintended negative consequences for the childcare sector. We've seen a 40% decline in childcare providers that coincides very clearly with expansions in 4K funding.
So part of what we're celebrating today is it's an easy transition, but is the success of a research study. So Daphna and Katherine, from your perspectives, I'm sort of curious how you reflect on that in the case of the Tulsa studies of early childhood programs, and then Stephen, from where you sit, how do you sort of create the politics of research that can sustain many years and even in some cases outside of this study, findings like what came out of Tennessee? How do we navigate to create the success we've seen in Tulsa?
I would say the first thing that people should do is clone Deborah and Bill. No, but I think the most important thing is that Bill and Deborah set out to answer questions that were of both scholarly interest, but also to answer questions that actually make a difference in a community. And they have always upheld the value of wanting to do work that is worthwhile and that provides the community with information that is actionable and useful. And I think I don't understand, I'm now old, but I don't understand my research colleagues that do research just to answer the question that interests them and no one else. So I think they've created a really good model of what it means to be both scholarly, rigorous and important, but most importantly, to be connected with, to understand, and to be responsive to a real community that had needs and interests in understanding how their programs were working.
Yeah, so ditto all that. I think, when I started graduate school, the kind of first Oklahoma RD study was like the state-of-the-art, most exciting study that had come out. It was a lot of like what seemed cool about studying early childhood. And so I think I was drawn to that initially, but I think what has been the most impressive thing about the work in Oklahoma that sort of inspires people to do the work is that it was not research just for the sake of research, like Katherine said, but as a really long-term commitment to kind of iteratively working together to ask questions and then ask them again and see how things change over time as context change, as things the climate changes. And I think now talking about like research policy partnerships is really common, and there are funding mechanisms for that, but I think that is sort of modeled after what the Tulsa work was without kind of having that name attached to it initially. So I think, the idea that researchers can try to both answer questions that are nationally relevant and address problems right now as we sort of come out of the pandemic about what we can do, but at the same time, there are a lot of like day-to-day operational questions that states are struggling with, where just sort of basic data is really useful, and that researchers can play the role of helping very busy policy people access that data, make sense of it, and know how to sort of incorporate that into the many factors that go into decision making is kind of inspiring, and the kind of thing that I think lots of researchers today try to do to emulate that kind of partnership.
Yeah, I would underscore, I think, that the way, sort of Deborah and Bill really set the tone really is what has allowed the partnership to grow and thrive over this. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years, but, I think they're on the ground, they're meeting. The testament to Ramona Paul was, it was, I think, evidence of the relationships and the depth of the relationships that they built at the State Department of Ed, but then with, unfortunately, lots of different superintendents that we've had in Tulsa over that period of time. But with each one, they've come and they've introduced themselves and they've talked about the importance of the study, both in terms of helping Tulsa and also the broader field. They've been incredible partners with the team on the ground at OU and with each of our teachers in classrooms. And so that notion of showing up to really try to help as Katherine said, the community get better, even as it then was broadcasting this and thinking about what are the implications of the work going on in Tulsa for other states and the country as a whole, has just been, I think, a model for how a research practice policy partnership has to just be alive and constantly improving and changing.
Yeah. I love how you said that, Stephen, the research practice policy partnership. Sometimes those P's get lost. But they're all critical, right? But even with them in place, there can still be unintended consequences for any of those components. So tell us a little bit about them.
You want to start? Well, I'll say that this question of what I would sort of say when people are sort of taking this just, does pre-K work, does it not work? That sort of simplistic as opposed to the much more nuanced and refined understanding of how is it working, for whom is it working, in what areas is it working, how can it improve, how do we get under the hood to really understand it? Those are the things that for us as practitioners, we wanted to understand better, because we wanted to constantly understand, okay, what is it that we can and should be doing differently in a world of limited resources, where we need to focus our instruction on some things at the expense of others? Like, what are those kinds of skills that we need to be emphasizing that then we in turn should be making sure that the professional development is focusing on, and sort of being able to understand those things and go along the way has just been sort of a big part of what has worked. And I think it's difficult for other places to fully appreciate the richness and robustness of how much work it takes from everybody to do this well.
Yeah. Other thoughts? And then I think we're going to move on to Q&A very shortly.
I think on the unintended consequences, it touches on things we've talked about before around kind of how do we invest in making something really good without worrying about these potential draws on other resources. And even in Build Back Better, there, even though it sort of started with both the pre-K and childcare pieces, there were a lot of kind of pushes to pit them against each other, or which is most important. Should we do this one or should we do that one? And I think those are kind of the worst kind of conversations to try to act like, it makes sense to put the education of 4-year-olds around at odds with the education of 2-year-olds and how we think about that as a system. So I think the kind of the most exciting paths, I think, are the states that are able to try to bring that all together in a really meaningful way, and whether that is something around governance and putting them all in the same organization, if it's something about leadership, about having a person who is able to really think about them simultaneously and control the resources and the funding, so that when you are working on improving access to preschool, you're actively thinking about that with the Head Starts in mind, and thinking, okay, where we're going to put these slots has to really make sense relative to where we have subsidies, where we have Head Starts, where we have buildings, where we have space, and really having that whole piece together. The work we're doing in Virginia right now, there is so much hard work around just even understanding those issues, because we have just sort of moved childcare to be together with Head Start and pre-K in one single organization, and even just answering the most basic questions about where are the programs and how many kids do they serve, and are they the same kids that go to both of these programs, or are they separate kids? Those questions are really, really hard, but having them all together and having one person say, like, we really must connect these data sources and must identify these kids and really get a landscape analysis before we can fix it has been really powerful. So I think there is kind of a lot of potential to get around the unintended consequences if we view it less as sort of like education for 4-year-olds and care and support, like work supports for the younger kids, and bring it sort of more cohesively into one sort of team of people working on the whole, not just 0 to 5, but just sort of 0 and up, educating and caring for kids.
For those of you that aren't aware, the fancy word that Daphna was trying to not use was unduplicated count, which is what a lot of states are grappling with in their state plans, is trying to come up with that unduplicated count. The last thing I would say, very early on in my career, when I was doing some work on preschool and pre-kindergarten, a very famous senior economist, who I will not name, said to me, she said, well, why would we want these kids in schools?
The gender.
Yeah, she did. She said, why would we want these kids in schools? We know that schools fail children. Are you just trying to have them fail children earlier? It was provocative. It remains provocative. But I do think attention to issues of cultural representation, race equity, dual language learners. Our schools, at best, are incredible bastions of education. At worst, they reproduce inequality. And so I think it's really important for us to not pretend that that's not the case. And it varies a lot from school to school and classroom to classroom. But we are increasingly a country that is diverse along lots of dimensions and lots of ways. And it's always been something we have to pay attention to in schools. But I think it looks different. So, and I'll just, very specifically, if you're talking about 3- and 4-year-olds, they're still learning languages. And so if they are in monolingual English classrooms, that's very different than being in a dual language classroom. And so there are considerations that are really important that I think we need to continue to grapple with in these school settings, and potentially unintended if we don't have the staff that can support the dual language learning, for example.
That's great. Thank you. What questions do we have from the audience? And then we'll take one from online.
Thank you. I think one voice that we haven't heard a lot from today is the voice of the teacher. And so I wonder if you guys could talk about kind of what do teachers in pre-K programs see as the successes and challenges of these programs? And what are they asking for from their schools, districts, and government?
I can start. I think for the past few years, starting before the pandemic and then throughout the pandemic, we have been fortunate to survey large groups of teachers, including teachers working in family childcare homes, childcare, Head Start, and pre-K, about everything, how things are going, compensation, professional supports, COVID, how things are in the classroom. I think teachers are incredibly committed to the work they are doing. You see such a high level of kind of commitment to the kids and sort of belief in the work. You also see teachers feeling very undervalued in society, undervalued in their day-to-day work, often undervalued even by other sectors, and not viewed sort of as professionals. So that's really hard. Teachers, I think, a lot of what teachers are wanting is just kind of what all of us need, which is basic supports to lead our lives. So a lot of what we see teachers write about is kind of inability to afford basic needs, and the amount of kind of teachers that are struggling in Virginia to meet their food needs, meet their basic kind of health needs, those kinds of things are really striking. And then there is a need for benefits, which is not kind of across the board available, especially in some of the sectors. And then as far as kind of what's happening in the classroom, teachers are wanting more supports, and especially right now, there are two kinds of things. One is that staffing is incredibly difficult. So a lot of schools and childcare centers are understaffed, and that means that for the teachers who are left, the job has become harder, more chaotic. They're being asked to do a lot more. So a lot of what they want is just enough people in the building to do the job, so it's a little bit more balanced. But then they are also dealing with children who are having really diverse experiences, and so we've had a lot of teachers ask for more professional supports, more mentoring, and especially around how to deal with children who might have greater needs. So things like behavioral issues, mental health needs of kids who may need support for learning disabilities, things like that. Teachers often feel like they are not well equipped to meet those kids' needs and want more support in those areas.
I will just echo Stephen's comment reminded me of that. So anecdotally, based on a colleague's work, a lot of discussion about not being included. So if you think about how there might be professional days for K-12 teachers, that really the K and the early childhood, it's a different type of supports that they need, and they may well have a principal who doesn't know early childhood and is focused instead on third grade test scores, or is focused on making sure that there's a block of time that is heavy curriculum on literacy in a way that doesn't align with really the way pre-K classrooms are maybe best delivered or best run. And so I think it's not just a sense of being like, oh, I'm undervalued, but also I don't have the learning community and the learning supports that they need to have help with behavioral challenges, because they look different when it's biting at, age 4 versus running out of the classroom in 5th grade. So I think there is, having brought them into schools, I don't think people fully appreciated how much the schools have to meet them where they are, as opposed to bring them along to where the schools are. So I think there is that perspective, along with the joy of seeing kids, right? Because in kindergarten and pre-kindergarten, they're still really excited to come to school. And so I know they often talk about that joy of seeing the joy of learning and participating in school too.
Do you have a question from online? No. Good. Well, I saw another one in the room.
Well, this question might sound unduly pessimistic, and maybe it is. So I think it's kind of unlikely that for the next 6 years through 2028 that the federal government is going to do anything significant in preschool or childcare for a variety of reasons, with the politics and the economics and the budgetary situation of the federal government. And interest rates going up are going to make that more difficult. And then at the state level, they temporarily were awash in money. And there's this huge childcare crisis. So some things have happened, but that money is going away. State governments will be in a year or two. We're not going to be seeing the same story trying to figure out what to do with all this money. And so therefore, I'm a little curious about what's the best policy strategy to try to, I'm assuming here that we think we want to see an expansion of early childhood programs, both in preschool and then support for childcare, and consider them together. But it looks like the funding's going to be, and the politics going to be extremely difficult for the next, I would say the next 6 years. What do we do in the next 6 years?
I was waiting for the question. As opposed to
What's
the statement.
The strategy?
No, I think, I don't know. Frankly, I don't know. But I do want us all to remember that in some places, at some points, it is a bipartisan strategy. And I think the workforce, the worker shortages are real, right? That companies are facing. And if it is framed and sold as a mechanism to get workers back into the workforce, I think that might have some traction. I don't know if they'll buy that, but I do think it's real. We haven't seen, I'm going to say this wrong, we saw a huge retreat from the labor market for mothers during the pandemic. And I don't know if we've seen that resurgence, but I think that's one angle, because I can tell you in Wisconsin, nobody can hire there's just not enough people to hire, and there's real sort of panic everywhere from our organic farms to our, state government for, basic entry-level jobs. So I think there's some promise of that strategy, but I don't know if it will be winning everywhere or in enough places.
So, I think that when you sort of take a big step back and you understand that the K-12 system is overwhelmingly state and local funding, right? And very little federal funding. And to the extent that there's been federal funding for younger kids, it has been focused on low-income kids, and it's been focused on essentially sort of thinking about it as a means of supporting people, low-income working adults, right? And so framing it as the beginning of the public education system and early learning, I think really invites there to be a much more robust commitment of state and local funding. And I think that in many ways, it resonates most powerfully at the local level, and yet very few communities have really tapped local resources to fund it. And I think that that's really a place where advocates need to do work, honestly. I mean, I remember very early on in the sort of national pre-K work when Pew was funding the pre-K now largely, and in a meeting of state advocates when we were having the, what is the perpetual universal versus targeted conversation, from a political standpoint, James Carville came to the group and said, essentially, don't be policy purists. If you want poor kids to benefit from pre-K, you better make it universal, because there's never a program in this country that's ever funded adequately if it doesn't serve the middle class. And I think, sort of coming out of COVID, we've begun to see the fragility of the child care situation and a degree of attention at the local level, just if you look at the number of local stories that have happened where there's a recognition of how important this is. And I think that's where we've got to focus a lot more advocacy work and build that base.
And I think there are some national organizations that are doing that, like the Children's Funding Project, is that what it's called, right? So we've had conversations in Wisconsin where we convene people, and I say we, people that I know convene people, and really looked at what are the tax opportunities that are maybe missing that we could get conservative people on board with. So one of the big ideas is that we should tax out-of-state lake home owners. Right? So they use our road, that sort of thing. So it's trying to find places or opportunities that could generate revenue that would be politically palatable for local communities and for state communities.
Yeah, I would say that it's hard and pessimistic to think about where we're at. At the same time, there's been some really positive things that have come in the past few years on this sector, like early childhood as a whole. And, I think Erica could talk more about DC and teacher compensation for early educators, which is really changing. I think you can look at places like New Mexico that will have, free pretty much universal free childcare, not universal preschool for kids 0 to 5. Almost all families, will have no co-pays and can send their kids to childcare. I think to your question, the reason those things are happening is because there were infusion of federal relief dollars, but I think some of the most sort of exciting and aggressive policymakers are saying, let's use those dollars now to do something big. Let's try to work with researchers as best we can to demonstrate that they have impact. And then let's have somebody really try to politically take those away from us after we put them out there. So there's some risk taking in that, but let's put universal childcare out there in New Mexico, and then who wants to be the one taking it back, and we can find the resources. So I think there is some kind of politics around this moment where we have a lot of resources, or more than we've had before, to put into childcare, and thinking about how to use that as proof points that hopefully can be used to make longer term investments.
So I think we could keep talking for another hour and maybe several weeks more, but unfortunately we have to call an end to it now. Thank you all for your time and your extraordinary insights.
You're not dismissed yet. Well, before I make some concluding remarks, and Deborah is going to make some too, I'd like to extend a hearty thank you to the wonderful McCourt School team, Crystal, Mariel, Sue, Michelle, and Lauren, who did a fantastic job of organizing the conference, managing the conference, and publicizing the conference. So please join me in giving them a warm round of applause. Until you actually do one of these things, you don't truly know how much work goes on behind the scenes, including work by our intrepid CROCUS fellows, Anandi and Tanya, so please thank them too. And I'd also like to thank the many foundations that have supported our work, including especially the Heising-Simons Foundation, which actually made this conference possible, the Foundation for Child Development, which made CROCUS possible, and the Smith-Richardson Foundation, which continues to support our work. When Deborah and I started CROCUS back in 2001, it's a year that my wife Rosie and I will remember because it's the year our daughter Angela was born. And so Katherine talked about the joy of learning that kids experience in preschool, and we certainly witnessed that with Angela when she was here at Georgetown in Hoya Kids. We actually also witnessed it when she was in a family daycare home. That was quite a wonderful experience for her. And so this has been a professional voyage for me and for others, but it's also had a personal dimension to it. I thought that this panel made some wonderful comments, and to their credit, they had a script and then they tore up the script and they they came up with another plan. I'd love to see what they would say if we gave them a second chance at this. So might be totally different. But they made some really good points, one of which is that ultimately we want to know not just whether a program works, but who it works for. And ultimately we want to know not just whether a program works, but why it works. And ultimately we want to know not just whether a program works, but how we can make it work better. And I think that we strongly agree with those important points. On the other hand, if you ask a simple question, and that simple question is, has Tulsa's universal pre-K program succeeded? My simple answer to that question would be yes. Based on the usual indicators, the enrollment levels have been quite high, the short-term outcomes have been stunning, and the long-term outcomes, on balance, have been very impressive. So why is that? I think part of it is that you have a high-quality program. Another factor that some of the panelists pointed out today is strong, persistent enrollment outreach efforts, not just by the principals, but also by community partners. Facility siting has been important. Karen Kiley noted that Head Start has gone to great lengths under Stephen's leadership and beyond to locate key facilities in tandem with the schools. That has all sorts of residual benefits for kids. You have a high preschool enrollment rate. That creates opportunities for teachers to do even more wonderful things, K through 12 and K through 3 in particular, because so many of the kids are ready to learn when they arrive at kindergarten. We've heard about strong philanthropic support. Not every community enjoys that. Tulsa does. We've talked about magnet schools and the role that they've played in Tulsa in helping to sustain the pre-K boost over time. And there are lots of other issues to be discussed about magnet schools. And if we had more time, we could discuss them. But on balance, the magnet schools representing the broader category of higher quality schools help to illustrate a point, which is that if pre-K benefits are to persist over time, you need a very strong K through 12 system. And if you don't have it, the kids are going to be disappointed. There's something we haven't mentioned really today because we ran out of time on one of our panels, and that is Tulsa Achieves. Tulsa Achieves was established in 2007, and it provides for free community college in Tulsa. And it's an important part of the Tulsa landscape. The presence of a free community college system in Tulsa means that students who dream of going to college have a reasonable expectation of fulfilling that dream, even if their household income is low. It gives them hope, which can sustain them and motivate them through difficult times. So that's another important part of the picture. Does a program have to be universal to achieve all the benefits that Tulsa has produced? The short answer is no. We can certainly find examples in New Jersey and North Carolina and other states of successful, very successful targeted programs, not just in the short run, but in the long run. But a universal program does have certain advantages. By blending students from different socioeconomic backgrounds in the same classrooms, and by giving them shared experiences, a universal pre-K program promotes positive peer effects. By ensuring that the overwhelming majority of students are ready to learn when they arrive at the kindergarten door, universal pre-K enables elementary schools to set higher standards and to keep students engaged and motivated. When Liz Cassio of Dartmouth University has systematically compared universal pre-K programs and targeted programs side by side, she finds that the universal programs do a better job. So those are some of the lessons that I have learned from all this, but as always, I'm eager to hear what my esteemed colleague Deborah Phillips has to say.
Thanks, Bill. I opened my comments this morning by talking about gratitude. And I just have to say, I'm afraid I'm going to get very emotional here. It's been an amazing day. And so many of you in this room at different stages in this project. Some were here at the beginning, some were here in the middle, some I met towards the end. And to have you all here and those of you online and talking about this work has just been incredibly moving, and I am grateful to every single one of you for the various parts you've played in this journey. It's been really something. There was talk on this panel about partnership, and a lot of the talk was about Bill and me, actually, which was a little embarrassing, but the other half of it is that in Tulsa, for whatever reason, and I think, Bill, you'd be the first to agree with this, we walked into this incredible atmosphere of trust. I don't know where it came from. I don't know if it's in the water. I don't know what it was. But, we just came out of nowhere, right? Georgetown University. That helped, as I recall, with David Sawyer. Ramona Paul, Steve, you, Cindy, it was incredible. It was like, come on in, But so the piece that's just that element, that kind of intangible thing called trust, you also have to earn it, of course, but there was just this kind of, it was in the air from the beginning. Two other things I wanted to mention, though, about the receiving side, the other side of the partnership that I think, again, we both experience is the people that we were delivering the findings to took the bad news with the good. And there was never a sense that unless you're giving us, 100% good news, we're done with you. There was never that. We'll take the bad with the good, and I say bad, it's not quite the right word, because I think that all along the way, the attitude toward either null results or even once in a while negative results, or the dog that didn't bark, all that huge investment in that survey was, we've got to learn from what you found that wasn't working, or that, as much as we do from what did work, and that's incredible. And the third thing I would mention about that is you in Tulsa, those of you in Tulsa, also really truly shaped the questions we've asked. Not just facilitating our ability to address the questions that we came up with. I remember a meeting, and Anna, I'm positive you were there, with Deborah Gist and Stephanie Jones, and you and me, right? And maybe some others. No, you weren't there? Talking about what this Generation 2 study should focus on. Sherry, you were probably there. And they were basically saying, self-regulation, social-emotional development, and it was like, yeah, okay, we agree, let's do that. So this real mutual sort of, what should we, helping us understand what the questions ought to be, was really very important. I'm on the precipice of retiring. that's another reason why I guess I feel a little emotional right now. But I guess I want to close by saying something about when you work on the same project with many of the same people for so long and new people come along, it's so striking the intergenerational aspects of this. And younger colleagues joining the project that Bill and I started with so many of you, and then all of the students who've worked on this project and others, the younger people, and seeing this kind of intergenerational ongoing element to this is just, as I was saying to my high school girlfriends that I spent the weekend with, the reason I'm actually not upset about retiring, I'm really not, even though I kind of look like I am, is because I know this work's going to carry on. And I know you guys in this next generation, you're amazing. Students, you are amazing. And I can't wait to watch it from the sidelines. So anyway, thank you for this day. Bill, thank you for organizing this. It's just been phenomenal. Thanks to our funders, partners, everybody. So with that, yeah.
Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the plain, and the waving wheat can sure smell sweet when the wind comes right behind the rain. Oklahoma, every night my honey lamb and I sit alone and talk and watch a hawk making lazy circles in the sky. We know we belong to the land, and the land we belong to is grand. And when we say, aye-yi-fi-oh-yay, we're only saying you're doing fine, Oklahoma, Oklahoma, okay.
Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the plain. Oklahoma, where the waving wheat can sure smell sweet when the wind comes right behind the rain. Oklahoma, every night, my honey lamb and I, every night we sit alone and talk and watch a hawk making lazy circles in the sky. We know we belong to the land, and the land we belong to is grand. Yippee-ki-yay, yippee-ki-yay, yippee-ki-yay.